In around the winter of 1989, not too long after the Berlin Wall fell and communism began to disintegrate, many tens of thousands of Jewish people were pouring out of the former Soviet Union. And I was praying one morning, and God showed me a vision of an oasis in the desert. And though I didn't have any idea what it meant at that moment, I, in simplicity, asked God, "What's this about?" And He began to help me understand that what I was looking at was a visual image of what He desired to do here in Israel, that it would be a place of refuge, a place for people to receive supplies and healing, and then a place for people to be sent out again. And in simple terms, that oasis vision was what resulted in the creation of Tents of Mercy. I actually heard that phrase, didn't know it was in the Bible at the time. It was only about 5 years later that I was reading in the book of Jeremiah and suddenly saw it in chapter 30, verse 18, where it talks about God bringing the people back to Israel from the exile of the Jews, and for Him to restore the tents of Jacob and have mercy on our dwelling places. And I was stunned to see that 5 years later, but in the interim, I was in the States when I had this vision. My family and I made Aliyah. We came to Israel, became citizens, settled up in the northern area in Haifa, and bit by bit, God began to put the pieces in place to fulfill that vision. I took several years to become a part of the country, learn the language. I had no desire to. I actually didn't think I would found anything. I was not trying to plant a congregation or a humanitarian aid effort. But as it turned out, that was what God had in mind. And so I found myself in the Haifa Bay area. In 1995, we began to pray toward this concept of an oasis. And the oasis included centrally humanitarian aid, because we knew that there were many people coming back. There was still a flood of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. Later on, we realized there were also newcomers from Ethiopia and other countries. And we just began with a few little cardboard boxes of used clothing, and we only graduated into food later, which now has become really the main thing that we supply. But I began to see the opportunity to minister in homes, to start little Bible studies. And so by the towards the end of '95, we had 3 of those little home cell groups. And these were all with immigrants. I was leading in Hebrew, not in English, albeit baby elementary Hebrew, but Hebrew nonetheless. And it was out of those original groups that we saw the need for a congregation, that those 3 groups would come together. We rented a space in a warehouse industrial district to the north of Haifa. And that was how it started. And I was, if you would say, the founding shepherd, spiritual father of that work. And at the same time, we had this modest distribution of humanitarian aid, which now has grown to a couple of warehouses and some really wonderful distribution. Really, Chuck, it contains 2 elements. One is to plant Hebrew-speaking Messianic Jewish congregations in Israel, Israeli congregations. And the other, as I mentioned, is humanitarian aid, aiding the poor and the needy. And we see those 2 things fitting together extremely well in the pattern of the book of Acts. In fact, in the book of Acts, there was, of course, a centrality of Yeshua, fullness of the Spirit, celebration of Torah, and then you had this element of giving aid to those who needed it, helping the poor, as well as sending out teams to start new works. And that's really where we've sought to take our pattern. We don't see ourselves as anywhere near their level of power and release of the Spirit of God, but I believe it's the pattern that God has given us for anywhere in the world, but specifically for here in Israel, because the last time the Spirit of God was working and people were following Yeshua here in Israel was in the first and maybe part of the second century. So I don't think we can improve on that model. It is, I think, clear to most people, but worth restating that although Israel is the birthplace of the gospel, it also has been blocked from the gospel for easily 18 centuries. And as the church became more and more Gentile in character, although it began as a Messianic Jewish expression, and then the church fathers began to spew out anti-Semitism in a completely tragic way. That followed with history of crusades and the Inquisition and the Holocaust and pogroms, and it just what happened was that the Jewish people said, hey, we don't want any part of this. This Christianity stuff is not for us, because obviously it destroys us. And so when you're talking about evangelism in Israel, what you're really talking about is altering a nearly 2,000-year misconception. And of course, Jesus is Jewish, and I'm Jewish, and the country is Jewish. We're speaking Hebrew, we're reading from the Hebrew Bible, and yet that has been basically lost on our people. And for most of this history, it's also been lost to the awareness of the church. But the church is awakening, as exhibit this opportunity to speak with you. And the Jewish people are at a stage, let me speak of Israel rather than worldwide Jewry. In Israel, there's a spiritual hunger. So to answer your question directly, we engage the concept of evangelism as very much a relational issue, rather than trying to do massive meetings or literature distribution. What we feel is the place of the greatest penetration and heart connect is really one-on-one or family to family. And what I have seen is not great waves of people receiving Yeshua as their Messiah, but what I see is a process of the ground softening. I think there's a plowing season. You know, back in many years ago, I was a hippie farmer on a commune, and I learned some things about farming. And one of the things I learned is you got to plow up the ground. You've got to soften the ground to receive the seeds before you can ever expect a crop. And so I would say that we're in a season definitely of plowing. In terms of discipling, what I've seen most fruitful, and I think everybody works in a little bit different way, but I honestly, even though I've tried several times to start a Bible school, training center, these kinds of things, what I have found is that one-on-one father-to-son relationships are what, for me, produce genuine disciples. And God has been very gracious to me, Chuck, that over these years in Israel, I've been able to mentor several young men with tremendous capacity. I mean, I think as a true father, most of us, you know, we want to see our children surpass us. And that's literally what's happening with these men who are spiritual sons. They're Israelis. Their ministries are in Hebrew. And it's just been through personal investment, just spending time together, praying together, talking honestly, me sharing my heart, them sharing their struggles, their hopes and dreams, and then helping to resource those hopes and dreams so that they're not just thrown out on their own. And even now, I'm seeing a fresh crop of young potential leaders that have asked me to mentor them. And that's also a very personal process. So that's where I see the fruit coming. Well, I think there's a very simple formula to that. Maybe I'll say the first thing is education. First thing is really learning. There are a lot of misconceptions. There are a lot of misunderstandings. Who are the Jewish people? What about the Messianic Jews? Are they into some weird, offshoot that's not doctrinally healthy? Of course, I would say that we are completely new covenant healthy. But these are important questions to answer. A little bit about the history of Israel. And then obviously the role of an intercessor, that someone would come before God. You know, this is the original concept of biblical priesthood, is to bear, in fact, Aaron, the first high priest, bore the guilt of Israel on his chest with the breastplate of the 12 tribes before the presence of God. And this is a very sacred, very essential kind of a role that is not to be just sort of blown past. Oh yeah, prayer. You know, we always say, we always say prayer because we don't want to first say finances. You know, but really intercession is the spiritual foundation, and Isaiah talks about it. He says that God is looking for watchmen on the walls, and 2 chapters earlier he says, "I've called the sons of foreigners to build up your walls," and I connect those two passages very strongly. The third item would be resourcing. And Isaiah talks about this also, that in the 60th chapter of Isaiah, in fact, I would recommend everybody read that slowly and meditatively, because I've found 5 keys in that chapter of what God calls Gentile believers to do in relationship to the remnant of Israel, the Messianic Jewish restoration that's taking place. And a number 4 would be to come, just to come physically and to meet us. You know, relationships are really the stuff of the kingdom of God. And I have found that several deep and lasting friendships are worth hundreds of superficial interactions. That this is the nature of God. God calls us into intimacy with Himself, but He also calls us into intimacy with each other. And so we've seen a ministry be built really over a 20-year period of time here in Israel on the basis of those relationships with people who want to get involved and whose hearts God is drawing. I do what I do because Yeshua appeared to me supernaturally over 40 years ago and captured my heart and delivered me from all of my useless self-effort to become a pure person. As I said, I was on a hippie commune in the mountains and eating, you know, the simplest food and using almost no money and just out under the stars and just trying to be as pure and simple as I could. And it was only when I saw Yeshua on the cross bearing my selfishness and my self-centered nature and pride that I was set free to be, you know, what I had hoped to become. So that's the bottom line of why I do what I do. But why I do what I do here in Israel is that over the years, in reading the scriptures and listening to other people speak from the Word of God and share their own stories, I came to realize that there was something so huge, so like a conclusion to history, that God was calling for in Israel. And there I am in the United States, and I'm comfortable, and I have a multi-level home, and everybody in the family has a car, and everything's going great. But I'm thinking, no, Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and all these guys, they were saying it's going to end for the Jewish people in Israel, and there has to be a spiritual awakening. And one day, all the way back in '77, I heard someone speak who was living in Israel and say, how do you think that Israelis will discover Yeshua if there's no one who knows Him to explain who He is? And it just gripped me, and for the next 15 years, God prepared me, so that then when we came in '92, it was like, wow, this is the fulfillment of our life. Now, I'm not saying that it's easy. In a way, it's the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life. But I would also say quickly, it's the most rewarding. Well, I very much would like to just introduce people to this book, Chuck, and it's called What About Us? And the subtitle is The End Time Calling of Gentiles in Israel's Revival. Essentially, what I've done with this book is seek to answer a question that was literally asked of me by a woman who was visiting Israel. She was touring the country with us and praying together with us. And we finished giving our presentation one evening, and she came up virtually in tears. What about us? What's our place? Don't we have some way of participating in this? And the answer is absolutely, and God speaks about it in many places. So what I've sought to do with this book is to combine a foundation of biblical response to that question, which spans really the entire scriptures in my view, with many vivid images, together with my own experience on just about every continent of meeting Christians who have touched my heart with a level of their loving brokenness toward Israel, toward the Jewish people, and desire to do those things that we talked about earlier, of the intercession and the resourcing and the participation. And what I've done is I've taken as a paradigm for the book the story of two men, a Gentile king and a Jewish king. And this is the story of Solomon, King Solomon, the son of King David, and Hiram, who at the time was the king of a town up on the coast in Lebanon. You could think of him as the king of Lebanon. And Solomon contacted Hiram after David died. And he said his first words to Hiram were, "I know you always loved my father David." And there was something about those words, Chuck, that just, to me, unlocked it, that this was a relationship of covenant friendship. It wasn't just a military economic alliance. Solomon said, look, in so many words, I love my father, you love my father, I think we have something to do together. And they built the temple in Jerusalem, which we always call Solomon's temple, but I think you could just as easily call it Solomon and Hiram's temple. So here's Hiram, a Gentile, and he and Solomon partner to create an address for the glory of God on the earth. Now, I can't think of a better paradigm. So my point of view and what I've expressed in this book is that God has called us as Messianic Jews and as Messianic Gentiles, if you will, to a deep friendship. It's not that one is superior to another, and I deal with that extensively in the book because I want to wipe that out. There's no need for inferiority. There's no sense of, well, Israel's the chosen people. It's too bad I couldn't be a Jew. That's unbiblical. God didn't make me a woman, and He didn't make my wife a man. There's a point to this, and that very parallel is used in the epistles. So I would like to just add this, that there is a divine calling for every true Christian who is discovering God's promises and plans for Israel. And I'm eager to interact with that and hope that people will gain insight from this little book.